Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Pianists, Chord Guys versus Line Guys. Now, we've been talking about this concept initially with respect to conductors, and it really is an interesting and useful one to sort of conceptualize your experience with different performers, and it helps to sort of fortify your expectations and guide your ear when listening. Now, remember the distinction. Chord guys are musicians who emphasize sound, vertical sonority, multiple notes played at once. And in the piano, of course, that means touch, tone, what timbre they get out of their instrument and how much they care. Some pianists care more than others. And also the balance between the two hands. I keep doing this. That means piano, right? Yeah. That's me when I was practicing. And these are yes, beautiful dulcet tones coming out of the instrument. And now, when we talk, and line guys, of course, are less interested in overall sonority and more interested in counterpoint, forward motion, shaping long phrases, building musical paragraphs. And this does not mean, by the way, that chord guys are not interested in lines and line guys are not interested in chords. All great artists do both. We're talking simply about weight of emphasis. And all music contains both, by the way, in one way or another. Most music that's traditional music, with like tunes and things. You have to have both to be a great artist, of course, but you can be known for certain aspects of your talent, for projecting elements, that have more prominence than other elements. And that's what we're talking about. So some of these distinctions are really quite subtle. And there can even be arguments as to whether an artist fits one category or another. And most artists fit neither. Most of them are just there in the middle somewhere, and you can but there are some who are outstanding for aspects of their art that really give it character and personality. And that's what we're talking about here. So I have 5 chord guys and 5 line guys. Now, when we talked about conductors, I actually began with pianists because I thought it was very easy to hear the contrast between two such, and they are on these lists too, and we'll talk about them momentarily. But we're going to start with the chord guys because it's a good way to get to know some of these artists. The most famous chord guy in the history of pianodom was Walter Gieseking. Without question. Gieseking was a kind of German conductor. He was like a Nazi, actually, who was a specialist in French music, and Debussy in particular. His Debussy is légendaire, really a wonderfully gifted, sonorous chord guy. Now, most of his recordings, I think they're all actually mono, and so you may not hear the subtlety of his voicing and handling and touch, but it comes through well enough, especially in the latest remasterings and whatnot. I have this huge Gieseking box sitting here that I actually never quite got to talking about. I probably should one of these years. Of course, it's out of print, but Anyway, Walter Gieseking and his Debussy are famous, and of course, these particular chord guys are associated with certain repertoire, especially Debussy. More than anything else, Debussy, because Debussy was a chord guy composer. And we have a talk coming up of chord guy composers and line guy composers, because that's also important. The repertoire is a reflection of, that they choose is a reflection of their own predilections. So Walter Gieseking is someone to keep in mind, and you listen to it for his Debussy to get a good sense of what he was doing. Then Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli, who was one of the ones we talked about in our conductor video. He's another unbelievable perfectionist. Every note, every chord had to be beautifully balanced, perfectly weighted. For that reason, his performances of people like Beethoven tend to be controversial and very cool as well. Because when you're spending most of your time, handling chords one at a time, that doesn't give you much opportunity for assembling them into larger sections. And also, in more line-oriented music, the underlying chord isn't as important as the shape of the phrase, which means there are times when you don't want to be in strict proportion, when you don't want everything to be perfectly balanced all the time. You want some things to have more prominence than other things. These are all artistic decisions, of course, that great artists are making all the time in shaping their interpretations. But Michelangeli was another one who's extremely famous for his Debussy, also for some Chopin, for Rachmaninoff. Because a lot of the Russian composers particularly were chord guys. His Ravel piano concerto. These were all composers who placed a premium on weight of sonority. One way or another, there is weight of sonority. And he was sonorous. You have to give him that. He was amazing, absolutely amazing. After Michelangeli, a pupil of them both, Ivan Moravec, the great Czech pianist. Now, Moravec played a lot of line-oriented music. He was a fabulous Beethoven pianist. He really was. But he was also enormously concerned with sound. He was a great Chopin pianist. Chopin's more chord-oriented music, such as the preludes, for example, which Moravec played magnificently, the nocturnes as well. His French music, his Debussy was stunning. His Mozart was incredibly beautiful. And his Mozart piano concertos particularly. Mozart was a chord guy, actually, to a certain degree anyway, in his more vocal-oriented music where he's dealing with beautifully set up accompaniments and melodies that float, it seems, in space. It's really quite incredible. That's the hallmark of a great chord guy. Mozart got more line-oriented as he got older. We're going to get to that. That's next video. Anyway, Moravec is definitely a chord guy, and he was proud of it. He used to carry his own piano tuning stuff with him and tinker with the piano and make sure the voicing was perfectly even and the keys all had action that was regular and weighted properly, and all of that mattered. He chose his instruments very, very carefully for his performances. After Moravec, Yuri Egorov, who was just a tremendous pianist, another great Debussy and Chopin pianist. I mean, those are the composers who keep coming up, I think, when you talk about chord guys, and a few others too, Scriabin, for example, and, people like that. But Egorov made gorgeous recordings of Debussy's piano works and some Chopin works and some Schumann and other things like that. He was definitely a chord guy. He passed away from AIDS at a young age, very sadly, but there was an Egorov box that Warner released not too long ago, and it may still be kicking around somewhere. And last but not least, one of the most interesting cases of all, Claudio Arrau. Claudio Arrau had one of the most famous sonorities in all of pianodom. His piano lineage goes back to Liszt, which is like kind of amazing. But he was known as a Beethoven pianist more than anything else. And Beethoven was a line guy. And so that's very, very interesting. And Arrau's Beethoven performances they're magnificent, but they arouse a certain amount of controversy because they could be rather slow and rather heavy and very serious. Because every chord, he had this dark, left-hand oriented sonority to his piano tone, which makes his recordings extremely memorable, but not to everybody's taste, especially in the German Romantics, who were contrapuntists at heart. And it's very, very interesting to listen to his performances, to see how he uses his chord orientation to project the linearity of the music. I mean, these are all the words I'm throwing out, and it's very difficult to just describe because unfortunately I cannot get permission to play samples of all of these people from major labels. They won't do it. They won't let me do it. You have to find them on YouTube or listen to them yourself. But I can describe it, and hopefully you'll hear it. And that's basically the best I can do at this stage of my existence. Hopefully YouTube will loosen up someday, or some of these labels will. Anyway, now the piano line guys. Line guys, Glenn Gould, the ultimate line guy. He basically played Bach, and composers who sounded like Bach, like Hindemith, composers who wrote piano writing that was linear and that's sort of contrapuntally oriented. I mean, the piano is a wonderful instrument for counterpoint, of course, because you have two hands that can play lots of notes, and you can do multiple voices at once, and balance them perfectly. And that was Glenn Gould's thing. And he sang, he also added a line usually. He was usually singing when he played as well, which is kind of annoying. But, if you listen to Glenn Gould play Beethoven or Mozart, and Mozart particularly was just, oh my God, Mozart, who was a chord guy, his idea of doing Mozart was like, oh dear, not right. And sometimes Beethoven too, because he just was not into the chordal aspects of their art. You see, great composers, of course, they do it all. They really do it all. And great interpretations of the great composers also have to do it all. But sometimes, what makes a performer special is his ability to do some things better than others. And so we get some very strange interpretations. And Glenn Gould was one of those. But his Bach is the most linear Bach you'll ever hear in your life. Another line guy, Rudolf Serkin, he was never known as a pianist who was interested in sensual tone, but he was a wonderfully probing artist who could really shape a phrase and create momentum and energy from accent and all the things that make the lines stand out as if highlighted, not like in a vulgar way, like you plonk out the right hand and ignore the left, or vice versa. No, but just understanding how the music works and which parts you need to bring in. There's something called voice leading. Voice leading is where you find whichever line you're working on, and you guide the ear to where in the musical texture it should be listening. And good voice leading does that. It shows you how the music is put together and how it's functioning, and which lines are important as they let's say assume prominence and greater or lesser prominence. Let's put it that way. So Rudolf Serkin was one of those. He was a great Beethoven conductor, also a great Mozart pianist. Pardon me, a great Beethoven pianist and a great Mozart pianist. Mozart, who was a chord guy, sort of, kind of. But when you're playing a tune, you're playing a line, so you got to have both, and that's why it's not always 100% clear that you're one thing or the other thing. You have to be both. After Rudolf Serkin, Sviatoslav Richter, he was another major line guy. He didn't give a damn what his piano sounded like. He really didn't. I mean, he's famous for that. In fact, I had a conversation with Ivan Moravec about Richter. And Moravec just assumed this pained expression with his wife, and they say he was so great, but he never cared what his piano sounded like. He just didn't care if it was out of tune, if he was playing in a bar. He just didn't give a damn. Well, that was true. And there are many Richter recordings where you have pianos that sound like garbage, that are out of tune, and it's really kind of astonishing for a pianist of his level of greatness. And he played everything. I mean, that's the thing. He did the line music. He did the chord music. He did Debussy very, very well, actually. Because there are linear aspects to that music too that you can hang your hat on. And he wasn't immune to beautiful sound. He wasn't immune to gorgeously proportioned or weighted chords. As Chopin shows that. And of course he was. When the music demanded it, he could do it. But his predilections were definitely more linear and line-oriented. After Richter, Martha Argerich. Oh, is she a line guy? I mean, really a line guy. Maybe just a guy. I don't know. She's really a force of nature. Let's put it that way. I mean, a force of nature. Martha Argerich is so forwardly propulsive in most of her playing that, you don't even think about chords and lines. You just think about movement. It's just going. Things that she did, like her Liszt sonata, or her even when she does the Chopin preludes, which are really sort of chord works. They have this biting linearity, this energy that's always pressing forward. And her concerto recordings too, her Prokofiev Third, her Ravel G Major, really, really amazing. Her Beethoven 1 and 2. She's a difficult artist to pigeonhole because she's so weird in her own performances. She doesn't play solo anymore. So there are very few solo recitals. And, the other music that she does are concertos and chamber works. And she's made 1 billion recordings of the same things over and over and over again. And it's all very, very eccentric. But it doesn't change the fact that in terms of her own personal aesthetic and the way that what she brings to the music is a very line-oriented approach. So there's Martha Argerich, and last but not least, certainly not least, Marc-André Hamelin. Hamelin he's of course amazing. He's technically one of the most astonishing pianists that ever lived and is still living and is still making recordings. He's also a distinguished composer. He is extremely line-oriented as well, I would say. And for good reason. He does very complex music that involves multiple layers of texture. For example, his performances of the Godowsky etudes, the Godowsky Chopin etude arrangements, where you have 2 etudes going simultaneously in both hands, and you have to make distinctions between different levels of sonority and more than 2, as often as not. And in order to do that kind of thing, you must be essentially a line guy, because you have to be able to not have blend. You don't want everything to smush together. You want things to stand out. It's very interesting, too, if you listen to Hamelin do Scriabin, who was definitely a chord guy. Even there, he's able to find the inner lines of the music, but all of it done with extraordinary virtuosity without slowing down to say, oh, listen to that line. Or his Alcon, his concerto for solo piano, which is one of the most dazzling things in the history of piano recording. It's all based on that wonderful, wonderful ability to clarify the thickest and densest textures and show the linearity of the music. So there you have it. Those are 10 pianists, 5 chord guys and 5 line guys. And there's always a tendency when you do one of these things and you characterize people to overplay your hand. And I don't want to do that. We're talking about subtleties, but audible subtleties, things that you can really hear. Once you get to know their art, once you get to know the music well, and you'll find, you'll make a decision as to what approach suits you best, what you believe suits the music best. So give them a shot. You can listen to these batches, and you can come up with some names of your own. I'm sure you'll have a few as you listen to the bazillions of pianists that are offering all the same music after all, and that should only help to clarify in your mind what these 2 somewhat opposite poles of musical expression represent in terms of actual performance. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.